Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. It is November 14th, 2025. We're a little late to the topic, but we're going to talk about the Tucker Carlson interview with Nick Fuentes and all of the aftermath. The interview occurred on October 27th, 2025, and we both watched the interview. Ness can give his thoughts. My thoughts are it was pretty tame, nothing that you wouldn't have already heard having listened to Nick Fuentes. I would say he toned down some of his more bombastic tendencies, but it was a pretty straightforward interview. I would say Tucker, he pushed back, but it was a generally non-confrontational interview. And it's very similar to how Tucker conducts most of his interviews, with the few exceptions like Ted Cruz, who he really went after. But lately, Tucker Carlson generally doesn't do confrontational interviews, and this was no different. But with Nick Fuentes, the mainstream position is that you should just ignore him and ban him. But if you do talk with him, it needs to be constantly challenging him and disputing everything he's ever said and throwing back the most extreme misogynistic or racist things that he's ever said. That's how an interview is supposed to be conducted. So just conducting a normal, somewhat friendly interview was beyond the pale for a lot of people. And if you hadn't known who Nick Fuentes was, you might have watched that interview and not thought much of it. And one of the most high-profile figures to, at least on the right, to react to the Tucker Carlson interview with Nick Fuentes was the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts. He gave a statement on October 30th.
I'll have more to say on this in the coming days, but today I want to be clear about one thing. Christians can critique the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic. And of course, anti-Semitism should be condemned. My loyalty as a Christian and as an American is to Christ first and to America always. When it serves the interests of the United States to cooperate with Israel and other allies, we should do so, with partnerships on security, intelligence, and technology. But when it doesn't, conservatives should feel no obligation to reflexively support any foreign government, no matter how loud the pressure becomes from the globalist class or from their mouthpieces in Washington. The Heritage Foundation didn't become the intellectual backbone of the conservative movement by canceling our own people or policing the consciences of Christians. And we won't start doing that now. We don't take direction from comments on X, though we are grateful for the robust free speech debate. We also don't take direction from members or donors, though we are inherently grateful for their support. And we're adding more every day. This is the robust debate we invite with our colleagues, our movement friends, our members, and the American public. We will always defend truth. We will always defend America, and we will always defend our friends against the slander of bad actors who serve someone else's agenda. That includes Tucker Carlson, who remains, and as I have said before, always will be a close friend of the Heritage Foundation. The venomous coalition attacking him are sowing division. Their attempt to cancel him will fail. Most importantly, the American people expect us to be focusing on our political adversaries on the left, not attacking our friends on the right. I disagree with, and even abhor, things that Nick Fuentes says. But canceling him is not the answer either. When we disagree with a person's thoughts and opinions, we challenge those ideas in debate. And we have seen success in this approach as we continue to dismantle the vile ideas of the left. As my friend Vice President Vance said last night, what I am not okay with is any country coming before the interest of American citizens, and it is important for all of us, assuming we are American citizens, to put the interest of our own country first. That's where our allegiance lies, and that's where it will stay.
Much like the Tucker Carlson interview with Nick Fuentes, this statement by Kevin Roberts seems pretty unobjectionable on its face. Nothing he said really conflicts with the MAGA America First movement, at least on its face.
In the most explicit, literal terms of what defines MAGA, yes, I would concur with that. But to use the framing that we've used previously that I think is quite important to make sense of what's going on, to at least see the perspective of the Zionist Israel First crowd. If the idea of MAGA is indistinguishable from MIGA, which that is the bargain that these people think that they have agreed to by deeming to step down and give MAGA, which prior to Trump's second presidency really had no political power at all, but to give some real effect to that MAGA movement, the compromise was that it would be MIGA in foreign policy and MAGA in domestic policy. And if you listen to...
Let me just clarify, MIGA is Make Israel Great Again.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. You took the words right out of my mouth. If you listen to what Kevin Roberts says, if you assume that Israel is effectively the 51st state in the United States, then to act as though Israel is some sort of usurper, some sort of fifth column, would be the same as a Texan who thinks that this coalition that they're part of sees Texas as a member of the United States, and then all of a sudden the movement that they're part of acts like Texas is some subversive foreign entity. And this seems sort of absurd on its face because Israel is a foreign country, but that's not the way these people look at it, and that is not the way that the entire Zionist movement in the West looks at the American empire. That is what Zog is all about. It's a Zionist-occupied government. And so from that perspective, you put it in that framing, just keep it in that framing as you go forward. Understand that the MAGA side, the Zionist side, is looking at Israel as a state among the rest of the United States.
And the MAGA movement is susceptible to this MAGA framework because it is the MAGA movement is very Christian. Is a very Christian movement, and so that's why the ideology of Christian Zionism is so important, and why it's pushed by people at top level Jewish leaders such as Benjamin Netanyahu. He is a big proponent of Christian Zionism in the United States, and that is key to holding this coalition together. And so people like Nick Fuentes are very dangerous because he comes from a very strong Catholic background, and he presents the, as we've discussed in previous episodes, the unobjectionable for 1800 plus years of Christianity orthodoxy. The idea of Christian Zionism would be a heresy, would be anathema to the vast majority of Christian thinkers. Mainstream outlets such as the Wall Street Journal have been quite hysterical over the last few weeks. There have been multiple editorials that have appeared in the Wall Street Journal that decry what's happening and it's a very pearl-clutching, I would argue, hysterical reaction. And there's an article, I think, that epitomizes that from November 7th. It's titled, "The Crack-Up at the Heritage Foundation is a Warning Sign for MAGA World." So reading from that article, Kevin Roberts, who took over as the foundation's president in 2021, has moved aggressively to align the think tank, meaning the Heritage Foundation, to align the think tank with the Make America Great Again movement. And as Democrats revel in their electoral success this week, the divisions at Heritage highlight growing fractures facing President Trump's winning 2024 coalition. And the immediate cause of this conflict between Roberts and the Institute's old guard spilled into public view in recent days. Roberts posted a video, which we just played, defending Tucker Carlson, who drew widespread condemnation for his respectful interview with the right-wing influencer Nick Fuentes, an avowed white supremacist and Holocaust denier. Roberts' critics say the video amounted to a reckless invitation to anti-Semites to join the Republican establishment, which has long sought to keep at bay the party's most radical fringe. Jumping ahead in the article, Quote, while Trump himself has been supportive of Israel, a growing anti-interventionist wing in the Republican Party is questioning U.S. support for the country. Some conservative influencers have gone even further, repeating anti-Semitic tropes about Israel's influence over the U.S. and falsely suggesting that the country was tied to the killing of activist Charlie Kirk. So, giving some historical context to what's happening on the right wing right now, this can be viewed as another iteration of purging that has gone on within the conservative movement since the Cold War. And American conservatism has repeatedly policed its boundaries through moral denunciation. Each generation performs its own purge, usually in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, but always to separate populism from respectability. So in the 1960s, William F. Buckley Jr., who was the founder of National Review, he, a leading figure in the American conservative movement, William F. Buckley Jr. expelled the John Birch Society from the movement. The Birchers' founder, Robert Welch, had called President Eisenhower a communist agent. Buckley denounced their, quote, idiocy, barred them from National Review, and forced Barry Goldwater to distance himself. And the purge defined acceptable conservatism as anti-communist but not paranoid. Another round occurred in the late 1980s and 1990s. National Review senior editor Joe Sobran was fired after criticizing Israel and the, quote, Jewish lobby. Buckley said his writings had become, quote, obsessive about Jews. And then soon after, Pat Buchanan, who was a Reagan speechwriter and presidential candidate, he was branded anti-Semitic for opposing the Gulf War and describing Congress as, quote, Israeli-occupied territory. He defended John Demyanyuk, a Ukrainian-American auto worker accused of being Ivan the Terrible, a guard at the Treblinka death camp. And Buchanan argued that evidence against him was unreliable. And to many observers, Buchanan's public defense of an alleged Nazi war criminal confirmed the suspicions of anti-Semitism that had already surrounded him. Buckley and neoconservatives like Norman Podhoretz and Charles Krauthammer declared Buchanan beyond the pale, ending his establishment career. And so I would argue now we're seeing another iteration of that in the 2010s and 2020s with Nick Fuentes, a MAGA-era student activist briefly embraced by mainstream conservative circles. He appeared on Right Side Broadcasting Network in 2017, and he actually attended Turning Point USA's Student Action Summit that year. He was not an official speaker, and at that time he was part of the same youthful pro-Trump wave that groups like TPUSA sought to cultivate. But then after Fuentes began attacking what he called conservative Zionism and donor class control of the right, he was cast out of the conservative movement. And many of the same forces who are trying to expel Tucker Carlson from the conservative movement, Tucker was part of that same mob who was calling for Pat Buchanan back in 1999 to be basically Tucker called Pat Buchanan an anti-Semite.
Yeah, he implied that Pat Buchanan was an anti-Semite. We've played that clip before. I think it is important to keep in context the time. This was years after, 4 or 5 years after the National Review mainstream conservative establishment had turned on Pat Buchanan, and Tucker Carlson had dragged his feet and stayed quiet, kind of in the way of like a Matt Walsh today, and was eventually felt like he was forced to give a half-hearted criticism of Pat Buchanan. And it is true that he did. When it was required to step on one side of the fence or the other, he finally did climb down from the fence. But I think it is important to not have the insinuation that Tucker Carlson was leading a purge of Pat Buchanan, because that definitely was not the case. But he was pushed to say something, didn't say anything, wouldn't say anything, and then finally said something that implied that Pat Buchanan was probably in the wrong because he was obsessed with Israel. And that is something that he has apologized for repeatedly 25 years in the future. I think Jeff's revisiting the historical purges is useful, and there is a pattern there, but I think I might take some issue with how this latest iteration is being characterized. And I think there's a miscalculation on the Conservative Inc. Zionist side of things in the purge that they're enacting. But I think what they're trying to do with Nick Fuentes is not cancel Nick Fuentes, because he has already been marginalized. His career for the last 10 years has been one where he has received virtually no mainstream coverage at all, and that has changed recently. He has been jettisoned up into the stratosphere where a bunch of outlets that wouldn't touch him in the past are now touching him. And I think what they're trying to do is use him as a sort of David Duke figure to take down Tucker Carlson. But I think it's a miscalculation. It's not going to work in the way that they think it's going to work, because the media landscape has changed so much in the last 25 years, let alone the last 60 years since the first iteration of this purge.
So you mentioned Matt Walsh and compared Matt Walsh now in 2025 to Tucker Carlson in 1999. Matt Walsh is a commentator for Daily Wire. Daily Wire is headed, or I don't know, Ben Shapiro's not the CEO, but he's essentially the face of Daily Wire. So Matt Walsh works for Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro is a Zionist Jew. Matt Walsh is a very conservative Catholic. And I think Matt Walsh's silence on this issue has been deafening. I think it's very clear that he hides, in my opinion, maybe Ness maybe will have a more charitable view, but I think Matt Walsh hides behind his "I only care about America" shtick to basically not ever give any commentary on what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And he just says, "I only care about America." And I think that position is becoming increasingly untenable, and Matt Walsh has come under more and more criticism for essentially staying silent on this issue. And I think it's particularly potent because his colleague, Candace Owens, used to also work for Daily Wire. And as soon as she started speaking out against the atrocities that she believes Israel has been and is committing now against the Palestinians, as soon as she spoke up on that issue, she left or was fired. It's not exactly clear. She left the Daily Wire, and it's just very conspicuous that Matt Walsh has, to my knowledge, I don't watch him regularly, but he has not given any sort of definitive statement on the situation in Israel and Palestine, the issue of Israeli Zionist control over the United States, his colleague Candace Owens leaving the Daily Wire. I don't think he's spoken about any of these issues, and I just think he talks about how important free speech is and we shouldn't cancel people and you should speak your mind. And it seems like really he wouldn't have anything to say about any of these topics. He does 5, 6, 7 hours of content every week, and he's never thought it would be something worth discussing. The conclusion seems to be is that his boss is Ben Shapiro, so he's not going to speak his mind on this issue. And if he's compromised on this issue, it makes one think that what else is he compromised on? Can you trust him on anything, or does he have some restrictions on things that he can and can't talk about? Because it seems like Candace Owens, when she left, she has been speaking her mind for good or bad. I don't think anyone would say she's not speaking her mind, but there's some question whether Matt Walsh is.
She was fired from the Daily Wire. That's not something that's in dispute. She said it, and they have said it, that they separated from her. And the question here is the difference between institutional power and popular influence. And in the case, and there's also the necessity of institutional power outside of some sort of external resource production. Candace Owens got fired from the Daily Wire, but she married into a multi-millionaire family. And so she is able to survive without any institutional power in a way that Matt Walsh probably perceives that he can't, given his very humble background. But it is, at this point, his show is much bigger than Ben Shapiro's. He is the most prominent and most influential person in the Daily Wire, probably more influential than every other person in the Daily Wire combined, including Ben Shapiro, when it comes to popular influence. But in terms of what Candace Owens or even Tucker Carlson now have done, there is a real question about, even though they have enormous popular listenership and a lot of influence in that way, they have virtually no institutional executive influence at all. Tucker Carlson, the one thing that he spent his capital on with the Trump administration was trying to dissuade them from attacking Iran, and they attacked Iran anyway, and Tucker Carlson looked sort of silly in retrospect because that was something that the MAGA movement cried wolf about, saying that that was going to be a devastating thing that was going to launch the world into World War III. And instead, it looks like the Iranian theocracy is a paper tiger, and they pretty much folded. And Candace Owens now, in the same way that Nick Fuentes is trying to be used by the MAGA Zionist side of the right, of the MAGA movement in America, they are trying to use her in the same way that they're using him to destroy the reputation of Tucker Carlson, because both Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes have provided plenty of clips that, taken out of context, do look quite bad, sound quite bad at first blush for people who are not very invested in politics and in the online social media environment. And so, to echo what I talked about last week, I think we are seeing a power struggle among the right. And I think the Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson side of things is going to win. But with that win is going to be a massive reduction in institutional power of the right. And the Republican Party is going to come to look more like the AfD in Germany, where all the institutional power and influence in America is going to be in opposition to that ascendant populist wing of the Republican Party that is going to have very little in the way of resources.
So a key figure, I think, in this whole thing in terms of institutional power and credibility is J.D. Vance. And I think everybody rightly is watching him, how he's going to handle this split. And I think so far he has fallen more on the Kevin Roberts, I should say the Kevin Roberts 1.0 response, because as we'll get to in a minute, he sort of, Kevin Roberts issued a statement that in some ways contradicted his first statement, but we'll call that the statement we played earlier, Kevin Roberts 1.0, and J.D. Vance kind of aligned with that viewpoint where we are a big tent, if we disagree with somebody within our movement, we don't cast them out. We listen to them and we calmly and logically refute what they're saying. If they're being if Nick Fuentes is an anti-Semite, you shouldn't cancel and ignore him. You should talk to him. And if his ideas are so horrible, people will be able to see that. And we're against cancel culture. I'm putting a lot of words in J.D. Vance's mouth, but that's essentially been his take on this, and that's supported by his reaction to those young Republican text messages that were leaked a few weeks ago. He basically brushed them off and said, boys will be boys. And there was another White House young staffer who said something controversial. I don't remember the details, but basically J.D. Vance, this young staffer was first initially fired, and J.D. Vance intervened and said, we're not going to do that. And he had that kid rehired, that young man rehired to the White House staff. So I think J.D. Vance is on the Kevin Roberts 1.0 side of this thing.
Yes, I think rhetorically that is where he is currently positioned, but that will be forced by the institutionally powerful Israel first Zionist side of the split at some point. It's not going to be something that J.D. Vance is going to be able to maintain, this sort of aloofness that tries to, in no real concrete ways, urge people to have open discussions and not get caught up in internecine fighting. And I think the Zionist cause is fine with him rhetorically acting like that, as long as he goes along when he needs to go along with what the Zionists want to do. And in the case, to bring it back to the strike in Iran, he offered in the texts that were leaked about it some tepid opposition to the attack on Iran, but then immediately fell in line. And I think that will be the expectation. I don't know exactly how he will break when he is called on it, but I suspect that he will go the Zionist way and will at some point make some real acerbic attacks on the Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson side of the MAGA movement.
So you're predicting that in order for J.D. Vance to get the GOP nomination for president in 2028, he's going to have to take a firmer line. He's going to have to be on the establishment Zionist side. He's going to have to prove himself. He's not going to be able to maintain this sort of positioning himself on the Kevin Roberts 1.0 Tucker Carlson side of the debate, and he won't be able to align himself there and also be the GOP candidate in 2028?
I suspect he will not, because he will have no resources if he does that. And unlike Donald Trump, he's not independently wealthy. And we saw even with Donald Trump, he wasn't able to achieve his second election without an enormous infusion of cash from institutional power centers. And so J.D. Vance, even though he is rhetorically more adept, he's not as charismatic, not nearly as charismatic or well-known as Donald Trump. And coupling that with demographic changes that have taken place since 2016, plus the fact that J.D. Vance will have no money, I think will put him in an impossible position to try to win in 2028, even the GOP nomination, let alone the presidency, if he is not approved of by the Zionist MAGA side of the MAGA movement.
I referenced earlier Kevin Roberts 1.0. That is represented by the statement he made on October 30th in support of Tucker Carlson. Kevin Roberts 2.0 was the one that appeared on November 3rd.
But I have to tell you, to the students, that this old history professor made a mistake. And I'm not saying that your professors at Hillsdale make mistakes, but sometimes you can make a mistake with the best of intentions. And my mistake was not saying we aren't going to participate in cancel culture. We're not. My mistake was letting that, which we will never backtrack from, override the central motivation that I had in doing that. Because I can tell you as an old professor, but also as a dad of 4, there's one of those ideas that really worries me. It's an idea that has become cachet, not just on the left, but on the far fringes of the right. And that's anti-Semitism. And so let me say loud and clear, the Heritage Foundation, which has always not only stood against anti-Semitism, and I, if you know anything about my career, have done the same, we will never, ever, ever stop fighting against anti-Semitism in all its forms. And I mention that to the Hillsdale students, not because I believe you're flirting with that, but because, as a dad of 4 of your generation, and my kids don't flirt with that, I do know that several million Americans your age, especially young men, do. And our motivation at Heritage for making that statement was to begin appealing even more than we have to those largely disaffected young men who are looking for belonging and identity by following the wrong people. And so the second apology that I would make is especially to any friends, particularly Jewish friends, who, thank goodness because of their magnanimity, understand what Heritage and I are trying to say, that even though you appreciate the motivation and the intention and you trust us, we know that now is a particularly scary time to be Jewish. It is a time when the rise of anti-Semitism on the left, which is far more widespread and profound than it is on the right, at the same time happening on the right, means that it's very difficult.
It's sort of mordantly funny that the podium that Kevin Roberts is speaking at says, "Pursuing truth, defending liberty since 1844. And the eponymous institution, the Heritage Foundation, that is the extent to which you could go back and claim that the heritage of pro-Jewish Christianity extends. That's as far back as it extends. It probably doesn't even extend back that far. You can maybe see the beginning, the first roots of it. It would still be decades before the Schofield Bible and Christian Zionism really came into being. But in terms of the heritage of Christianity, as Jeff said previously, and as we have risked beating a dead horse by bringing up again and again and again, the vast history of Christianity is, by the definition of someone like Kevin Roberts, intolerably anti-Semitic. That is not just the history of Christianity, but the history of Christian thought. All of the most well-known names that people will be familiar with, from John Chrysostom to St. Thomas Aquinas to Augustine, Martin Luther, even the Reformers. The history is nearly 2 millennia of what would be deemed today to be wildly anti-Semitic, and that is the absolute heritage of Christianity.
And it's so important to dissect that very term anti-Semitism because it is used to encompass so much, not only Orthodox Christianity for 90+% of Christianity's history, but things like criticism that some American Jews seem to have more loyalty to Israel than to the United States. The idea that Israel has undue influence on the United States should stop supporting what Israel's doing, that what Israel is doing to the Palestinians is barbaric and is as bad as what the Nazis did to the Jews during World War II. All of those ideas, which are widely held by millions of people around the world and millions of Americans, those are all ideas that I would think people like Kevin Roberts and certainly the donors to the Zionist Jewish donors and even the Christian Zionist donors to the Heritage Foundation, they would certainly consider those ideas anti-Semitic. I can't help but compare it to racism because a lot of people nowadays kind of shrug their shoulders, roll their eyes at something being called racist, especially people on the right. Even boomers, a lot of times nowadays will roll their eyes at claims of racism. But the claims of anti-Semitism actually still carry some weight to right-wing people, and I think maybe this is somewhat wishful thinking, but I think that term anti-Semitism is losing some of its sting because it has been deployed so cynically and so ubiquitously that it's starting to lose any sort of rhetorical power that it used to have. So there's been a lot of hysterical reaction, as we said, to the Tucker Carlson interview with Nick Fuentes. The two things that I've noticed have been pointed out the most appalling thing specifically related to anti-Semitism that Nick Fuentes said or that he represents is, number one, Nick Fuentes' use of the term organized Jewry and the accusation that Nick Fuentes is a Holocaust denier. So those are both, obviously, any mention of those topics would certainly get lumped into this term of anti-Semitism. And Kevin Roberts was appalled, is supposedly appalled, but he's quick to say that his own children are not guilty of this. But many of the Generation Z and millennials are flirting with anti-Semitism. And so those two topics, organized Jewry, let's talk about that one. I guess many of the articles I've seen repeat that phrase that Nick Fuentes used in the Tucker Carlson interview, and they seem to think that just saying that is enough to, well, obviously that's an appalling thing to say that's anti-Semitic. But if you really break down what it says, it simply means that Jewish people act in a collective interest to advance the interests of Jewish people, whatever those interests are, fighting anti-Semitism, funding Jewish groups, making sure that Israel continues to receive military aid. It's any sort of collective action on the part of Jewish people to advance their collective interests. That's essentially what organized Jewry means. And I think any objective person looking at 2025, it would acknowledge that is obviously happening on a wide scale, and it's mentioned often by Jewish people as a great thing, and they're not hiding it. And it's one of those things that is obviously happening right out in the open, and it's seen as, it's presented as a noble thing that Jewish people do. But if you point it out, it's anti-Semitic. And then the other thing is Holocaust denial. That when you hear that phrase, you would think, well, this person is horrible. They're denying that the Holocaust even happened. They're denying that 8 million or 6 million Jewish people were killed, or however many it is. When oftentimes, even with Nick Fuentes and people like him, they're not denying that the Holocaust happened. They're simply questioning some of the talking points or some of the historical assertions that are made about the Holocaust, about the number of Jews that were killed, what actually happened at the death camps, the motivation of the final solution, and things like that. They're not denying that the Holocaust happened. They're questioning some of the specifics of the Holocaust.
Yes, it's the joke about saying if you only believe that 5,999,999 Jews died, then you are denying the Holocaust. And we have a much more contemporary example of this, illustration of the effect that Jeff is talking about there with October 7th. We can certainly see if the Zionists have their way, where in the future, if you denied that Hamas put babies in ovens and committed mass rapes on October 7th, you would be called an October 7th denier, whereas the Nick Fuentes position would be more akin to what actually happened, which was that there was a Hamas attack and a few hundred civilians died and a few hundred Israeli military personnel died, and it was a tragic day for the Israeli population, but that the most hysterical claims, those that largely exist without evidence, and many are based on frauds. We can get into Elie Wiesel and the whole Holocaust industry in the future, but suffice it to say that this term, just like anti-Semitism in general, the intention is to evoke certain associations with anti-Semitism and with Holocaust denial, while continually expanding the number of behaviors that can be described as Holocaust denial or as anti-Semitism. But I don't want to lose the forest for the trees here. It's easy for Jeff and I to get caught up in the truth claims that are being made here and pick them apart, but that is not really the point of what Kevin Roberts is doing. He is signaling that to maintain institutional support, this is the line that you need to have. It wasn't as if he really had some sort of Damascene conversion from a week and a half ago when he first instinctively defended Tucker Carlson, and Jeff corrects me, he said it's not a couple of weeks, it was just a few days, 3 days later, that Kevin Roberts flipped on what he had said previously and apologized and tried to be all self-deprecating and groveling that he's an old professor or a silly old man, just forgot and went off his rocker and started saying things he didn't mean, when of course he got the institutional directive that this was what he was supposed to do. And in his defense, to some extent, he is working at an institution, and there is an open question: if you are the head of an institution, is truth the highest value to be pursued without considerations of other things? And one of the biggest lies he did tell, knowingly or not, in his initial defense of Tucker Carlson is that he and Heritage would not at all be influenced by donors, which of course is absurd. Heritage doesn't survive without donors, and that's exactly what we're seeing the consequences of here. He went off the cuff, spoke in defense of Tucker Carlson, and then all of the donors that allow him to have his job and maintain Heritage as an institution told him he needed to do a hard 180 on that, and he did, because his alternative is to just be thrown out into the cold. There are very few people who have the charisma and abilities and audacity of people like Candace Owens or Nick Fuentes or even Tucker Carlson who are able to survive the institutional attacks. And to again echo a point, even those who are able to survive it, like Fuentes and Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, and maintain influence, there is a hard line to be drawn between influence and power in terms of what can actually be done, because just rabble-rousing without any effective executive power behind it doesn't do a whole lot.
So watching these two statements by Kevin Roberts 3 or 4 days apart, the meme "got the call" comes to mind, which is essentially somebody says something off the cuff that reflects what they really believe, and then some higher power gives them a call and tells them they're not allowed to say that, and then that person goes and retracts what they said. The Kevin Roberts clearly, at least in my estimation, got the call. So Ness astutely brought up this divide or this conflict between genuine grassroots MAGA and institutional MAGA, or Make Israel Great Again, and how these are competing influences. And so you have people like Ben Shapiro or the Heritage Foundation representing institutional conservatism, whereas you have the more plucky, less controlled, less predictable grassroots represented by people like Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes. But it's interesting to see these two competing sides localized within the same individual 3 or 4 days apart. So you have the Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens viewpoint expressed by Kevin Roberts' October 30th statement. Then you have the institutional Zionist position represented by Kevin Roberts' November 3rd statement. So the question is, will the real Kevin Roberts please stand up? And I'll throw it to you, Ness. Which of those statements, the October 30th or the November 3rd, which Kevin Roberts' statement more accurately represents what Kevin Roberts really believes?
Well, I think that's more of a rhetorical question than maybe a serious one, getting at the heart of what is in Kevin Roberts' heart. Although I think we could add some nuance there. I mentioned a Damascene conversion, and that was mostly tongue-in-cheek, but there probably is to some extent some reality where the wake-up call that Kevin Roberts received there, and I think probably the donors, when they got after him after he offered that initial defense of Tucker Carlson, they were probably surprised as well, because someone who's at the top of an institution should be a better managerial type than Kevin Roberts. It's a little bit perplexing that he would go off the cuff and offer something like that. It must have just been that he had a sense that Heritage was behind Tucker Carlson, and Tucker Carlson is this mainstream, well-known, popular name. And so, of course, we're going to stick with Tucker Carlson. And he did a disservice to the institution, probably in going off the cuff, because the assumption was that he would know better than to do that and wait for instructions to see what Heritage's official position was on Tucker Carlson. And Kevin Roberts is probably kicking himself now because he knew better as well in general, but he just thought this one was so obvious that he ended up, from his perspective, putting his foot in his mouth. And so in some ways, maybe he will be scared into having real beliefs now that are closer to what he said on November 3rd than what he said initially on October 30th. If that is the case, and it may not be the full case, it's hard to see exactly what is in someone's heart, but initially the Kevin Roberts 2 weeks ago came out much more in the Kevin Roberts statement that was offered on October 30th, but now, having been potentially a broken man, his real beliefs might have been closer, or might have become closer to what he said on November 3rd.
Ness earlier referenced Conservatism Inc., and that is a shorthand for the establishment, institutional, capital C conservatism, represented by, in the past, things are changing now, but in the past, the epitome of Conservative Inc. would have been the National Review and William F. Buckley. And I think probably the biggest, maybe the most visible in the media, at least, figure of Conservatism Inc. today is Ben Shapiro. And Ben Shapiro is clearly on the side of those two, that divide we were talking about, the November 3rd Kevin Roberts, the establishment, Big C Conservatism Inc. side. And he wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal on November 4th in reaction to the Tucker Carlson interview. He said, I'm going to quote briefly, "The American right is at a crossroads. A group of white supremacists known as the Groypers," those are the followers of Nick Fuentes, "is maliciously attempting to subvert the conservative movement. The main agent of their normalization within the GOP is Tucker Carlson, who is now being aided and celebrated by one of the key organizations of the traditional right, the Heritage Foundation." So it's not clear from this article if maybe Ben Shapiro wrote this before the sort of retraction that Kevin Roberts made, or maybe this article was one of the reasons why Kevin Roberts made that retraction.
Yes and yes. I suspect it was both of those things simultaneously.
So back to the Ben Shapiro letter. Quote, "Mr. Carlson's most common tactic is ideological laundering. He hosts guests with ugly ideologies, soft pedals their views, and launders them into mainstream respectability. He claims he's just asking questions, and that's precisely what he did last week. Mr. Carlson ignored Mr. Fuentes' most toxic views, providing him a signal boost while making him palatable for a broader audience. Never mind that doing so betrayed Mr. Carlson's friends. Mr. Fuentes spent years attempting to destroy Charlie Kirk, assailed his grieving widow, and says that Vice President J.D. Vance's interracial marriage ought to invalidate him for higher office." He goes on to write, "The Republican Party, like the Democratic Party before it, is at risk of being eaten alive by fringe actors. To follow it is both morally unjustifiable and politically obtuse. Americans reject this garbage. If Republicans cower before Nazi apologists and their popularizers, the GOP will lose, and deserve to. Our answer must be no. No to the Groypers and their publicists like Mr. Carlson. No to demoralization. No to bigotry and anti-meritocratic nonsense. No to anti-Americanism. This is our country, our party, and our conservative movement. We can't stand by while it is fractured by those who betray our most fundamental principles. If we lose the right, then we will surely lose to the left, and either way we will lose our country." When I read this letter from Ben Shapiro, the word that came to mind was chutzpah, because Ben Shapiro, as I remember, I was following politics back then. In 2015, he was one of the key never-Trumpers, the people on the ostensibly the right, the conservative movement, who were most vociferously opposed to Donald Trump becoming the candidate. He said pretty nasty things about Trump. Said he was just maybe not quite as hysterical as he is now, but he was close to as hysterical that the right cannot abide Donald Trump becoming the standard bearer. But now, flash forward 10 years, Ben Shapiro is is lecturing everyone else on what MAGA is and what MAGA isn't. And again, chutzpah is the word. And apropos of maybe not a whole lot, but here are some statements that Ben Shapiro, these are tweets that Ben Shapiro made. So this one is from September 27, 2010. Quote, "Israelis like to build, Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage. This is not a difficult issue. Hashtag settlements rock." And then Ben Shapiro from December 15, 2011, quote, "Ron Paul is manifestly insane. As in previous debates, he is now gripping the pen as he would the neck of a Jew."
Yes, we could have included Ron Paul as the intermediary between the Pat Buchanan purge and the attempted purge of Donald Trump, and increasingly it just looks like the conversion of Donald Trump in terms of Con Inc.'s attempt to purge the movement repeatedly. I don't disagree with Jeff's assessment, but there is, I think, more than a kernel of truth in terms of what Ben Shapiro is arguing in the Wall Street Journal, which I would also identify the Wall Street Journal as a very important part of Con Inc. I think it is probably the most prestigious part of Conservatism Inc., but that is definitely where it exists. But again, I think that it is correct what Ben Shapiro is arguing, that if this split really does occur and the institutional power of the right separates entirely from the MAGA grassroots of the Carlson, Owens, Fuentes network, that it is difficult to see how there is political viability going forward on the right, because this is all happening against the backdrop of demographic change and economic degradation. And so there is a lot of truth to the fact that the Republican Party, it's already an uphill battle for the Republican Party to maintain electoral prominence at the national level. And if a split like this, if a real rupture occurs, I don't see what the path forward for electoral victory will be. J.D. Vance, again, is trying to sort of split the difference and trying to fence it, but he's not going to be permitted to do so indefinitely.
We mentioned Matt Walsh earlier. Ness, I know you listen to him pretty regularly. Do you think he's in a similar position as J.D. Vance in terms of fence-sitting, not clearly taking a side, trying to kind of thread the needle between these two conflicting factions within the American right?
In some sense, yes, in that I think they are both trying to, in a very Erasmian sense, as the Reformation was happening, trying to keep the church from tearing itself apart. I think that's what both of them would like, for the right to not self-destruct. In terms of what they actually believe, I suspect, so this is just my conjecture, my speculation, that J.D. Vance is much more focused on attaining power, and that Matt Walsh's heart is far more on the Tucker Carlson, Fuentes, Candace Owens side of things. But there is a real question to be raised here. I think you could make an argument that Matt Walsh has achieved more in terms of real-world results, in terms of what he's done to get transgenderism procedures banned in hospital systems across the country, and from a much more modest position has done more to influence the actual execution of power that the Trump administration has overseen than Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, and Candace Owens combined, despite the fact that the three of them have a much larger audience. And Matt Walsh's audience is quite large too, but he's not as influential certainly as all three of them combined are. And yet, because of his institutional power, his association with the Daily Wire, he has been able to achieve real world things. And so if at some point he is forced to make a hard statement in an area that he has, I agree with Jeff's assessment that he doesn't want to touch it, but in fairness to him, it is not out of character for him to not touch it. He never touches those sorts of things, whether or not that was a strategic position that he took from the beginning, or if he has just conveniently been able to have a brand that doesn't talk about international foreign policy affairs, and the line that he has on Israel is the same that he has on everyone else, which is that he thinks that there should be no foreign aid and the United States shouldn't be involved, but that's as far as he takes it. He doesn't go into deep criticisms of what Israel is doing in the Middle East. And you could also say that there are things that are happening in Sudan that are every bit as horrific, maybe not on the same technological scale, but every bit as horrific. And people who in the West are concerned about what's happening in Gaza don't really care about what's happening in Sudan. And that's a whole other can of worms. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa in general is something that lots of horrible things happen all the time and have always happened since the dawn of time and before then. And there's just some level of exhaustion and embarrassed ignorance that the rest of the world maintains with regards to what happens there. But if you're just making a moral claim, there has been lots of atrocities that happen in sub-Saharan Africa and continue to happen today that don't garner near the attention that what is happening in the Middle East does. But if Matt Walsh was called on it and had a falling out with the Daily Wire and left, he would be in a position similar to what happened to Candace Owens, where he would probably become bigger than he ever had been, just as Tucker Carlson has a larger listenership and viewership than he did when he was at Fox News. But the question again is, does that larger audience translate to more real world power? And I think that the answer, at least up to this point, has consistently been no. And I think in Matt Walsh's case, it would be the same. He would just be another one of those influential voices that would no longer have any institutional power associated with his position, and his ability to get things done, to have lawmakers work with him and that sort of thing would be diminished.
That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. Talk with you next time.